Public Television, and our university partners, University of Idaho, Boise State University, and Northwest Nazarene University. Well, like most nonprofits, we need help during this time of disruption. We're not able to have our normal events, and some of our big fundraisers have had to be canceled or rescheduled. So if you'd like to help, you can text the word Boise to the number of 243-725. I encourage you to make a donation in any amount, as little as $5 or more. It all helps make sure we can help keep the lights on and deliver programs to you. So today we are pleased to present a certificate of recognition to Blaine Dillingham. Blaine is a senior at Timberline High School. This certificate is a recognition is awarded to a student whose character and work exemplify the spirit of City Club, our founding member Marilyn Schuler's commitment to human rights, civil discourse, and informed civic engagement. Unfortunately, the Marilyn Schuler event that was scheduled for April has had to be postponed, but we did not want to miss out on the opportunity to honor Blaine. Blaine, we commend you for your service and your work. Blaine is with us today, and we've asked him to provide some remarks. So Blaine, we'd like to hear from you. Thanks.
Marilyn Schuler, who directed the Idaho Human Rights Commission during an active time for the Aryan Nations, co-founded the Idaho Anne Frank Human Rights Memorial, and served on various advisory boards related to policy and human rights, had polio. At the Catholic school that Schuler attended as a girl, the only special treatment that the nuns gave her was letting her use the elevator. How gracious. Yet those who knew Schuler said she succeeded not in spite of those challenges, but because of them. An obstacle, an opportunity. I think we could all use to keep this in mind when disheartened with the state of society. It is imperative in our current world situation, as we try to have a productive civil discourse in a time of crisis, that we not forget what we are doing. Problem solving. Why? Because it reminds us to think outside the box. I'm honored to receive this opportunity. I'm very, very grateful. My experience in civic engagement has been in using a YouTube channel to try to interest more young people in politics, and in leading the Young Democrats Club at my high school, Timberline High School, in trying out some novel engagement strategies, one of which I'll share with you today. I've heard some political theorists comment that it's not a problem if there's low voter turnout among minorities or the poor or the young, that people will vote if they want to. But democracy is based on the idea of representation. It will not always make the best decisions, but it'll make decisions that are representative of what people on the aggregate want. So in a government, a republic or a democracy, founded on the idea that representation is the goal, it seems important to me that representation be accurate, that it be 100% representation. The 19th Amendment, for example, was smart. It was obvious. It was a natural extension of the idea that representation is the goal, giving voting rights to women. I spent my summer, this last summer, among other things, interviewing strangers for that YouTube channel of mine. And what I noticed was that women were more willing to talk about politics than men. And this is backed up by some data. As far back as I could find data, and after the 19th Amendment, women vote at higher rates than men. And this is impressive, given that for much of history, women weren't supposed to speak up. They weren't allowed to. Yet it is critical that they do. Perhaps I'm just biased by my two wonderful moms and the impressive work done by my all-female state legislative delegation from District 18, but I think women bring important perspectives to politics. Unfortunately, they're one of the few historically marginalized groups to vote at higher rates than their demographic counterparts. Young people is the group that I'm most familiar with trying to raise the voting rates of. And it is very hard to take a young person who has no interest in politics and get them interested enough to vote. Because the brain doesn't see whether or not you vote or whether or not you're interested in politics as just an action or a few actions. It sees it as part of your identity. But that identity is also very group-based. So we, Timberline High School Young Democrats, tried a strategy where we invited already existent friend groups to come to debate watch parties. Shout out to Representative Ilana Rubel for hosting those. To my surprise, a solid number of people showed up, and one friend group that went to that actually hosted their own debate watch party the next month and invited me. It was a testament to unconventional engagement strategies. Usually, debate watch parties are attended by people who are already very interested in politics, but we use it as the initial engagement strategy. To this day, some of the best political conversations I have are with people I had never talked about politics to before that debate watch party. Look, I don't face the challenges of someone like Marilyn Schuller, who had polio, or the people whose human rights Marilyn Schuller fought for. I am fortunate enough that all the challenges I face are those I got to create for myself. I choose to create challenges for myself because it's the Marilyn Schuller way. Use challenges as opportunities. Civic engagement, boosting voting rates, that's a challenge I'm happy to take on because it is really hard to get disinterested young people interested in politics. That it's so hard is what makes it so meaningful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Blaine. Excited to see where your life takes you. I'm always uplifted and encouraged when I hear from engaged students like yourself. And congratulations, and appreciate the work that you've done, and I'm sure you're going to continue to do. So thanks so much, and we're pleased to be able to honor you today, Blaine.
Thank you.
Sorry we couldn't do it in person. All right. I will now turn the time over to our moderator, Dr. Jen Snyder, who's the Boise State School of Public Service.
Thanks, Jeremy. So here's how today is going to work. We have 3 panelists with us. Each of them is going to make some brief opening remarks. And then we're going to turn things over to you, the audience. You'll have a chance to pose some questions. You can do that using the chat function. You should see a button at the bottom of your screen that says chat. There's also a Q&A button. Either of those will work. If that's not working for you for some reason, you can also email Morgan. That's morgan@cityclubofboise.org, and she'll compile those questions and make sure I see those. I'm going to do my best to present each question. We'll see how far we get in terms of time. I may group some similar questions together. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists for today. There are a lot of people in Idaho working on civility and its connections to public affairs, many folks at City Club, in fact, but also beyond. But the 3 women you'll hear from today have practical or scholarly experiences with civility or with incivility, and I think they're going to provide us with some perspectives on this issue that we have not heard before. Melissa Davlin is the host of Idaho Reports and a producer for Idaho Public Television. Prior to that, she was a reporter for the Times News in Twin Falls. Melissa is vice president of the Idaho Press Club and chairwoman of the IPC First Amendment Committee, which fights for access to public records and meetings for journalists across the state. She attended University of Idaho, go Vandals. She currently lives in Boise with her husband and their 2 children, one of whom is making an appearance today. She's a super mom, so thank you for being here. Nicole Foy, so glad you're here, is an investigative reporter at the Idaho Statesman. She has been a reporter in the Treasure Valley for almost 3 years. At the Statesman, Nicole covers government accountability in the Latino community in Idaho and in the agriculture sector. She graduated from Biola University and previously worked for the Idaho Press and the Orange County Register. Her Hispanic Affairs beat reporting won first place in the 2018 Associated Press Regional Awards. And last but not least is Dr. Stephanie Witt. She's Director of Training for the School of Public Service at Boise State University, go Broncos. She's also a professor in the Master of Public Administration and Political Science programs. Her research interests include intergovernmental relations and human resource management. She's the former editor of the Social Science Journal and has served as department chair, associate dean, and the associate vice president for academic affairs. All right, we're going to kick things off with having each of our speakers take just a few minutes to make some general remarks on the topic for today. And then we're going to turn over to Q&A. So you can feel free to start entering those into the chat or Q&A functions, or to email Morgan as we go along. So Melissa, if it's okay, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this topic of civility today?
Thank you so much. And I just want to congratulate Blaine and tell him that he did a fantastic job. So civility is something I love talking about. In normal times, in the before, I think the problem with well-intentioned people in power calling for civility is that it's too often used as a tool of oppression or a means to silence people with whom they don't agree or who make them uncomfortable. We were asked before this to kind of hear the word civility, and to me the word civility shares a root with civilization, and over the course of history, time and time and time again, we've seen people deem those who are uncivilized to be not worthy of freedom or a voice or respect or life. And that might seem like an extreme comparison, but think about that in terms of political discourse. If I'm an elected official in a majority party, I automatically have an advantage when it comes to who gets a seat at the table and who gets to have a voice in policy discussions. So if I don't like someone's ideas or attitude, I can dismiss them, and that's much easier to dismiss them if I label them as being uncivil. I don't get to just disregard their ideas. I don't even have to discuss their ideas. I can I can just call them jerks and move on, and I can get other people to do that as well. And too often we see people in power who are uncomfortable with being called out, and that's not just true in politics, it's true in so many aspects of public discourse. The Me Too movement has shown how uncomfortable men are with confronting systemic sexism and sexual harassment in the workplace. The Black Lives Matter movement showed how uncomfortable white people are with confronting systemic racism that people of color have had to live with on a daily basis. And here in Idaho, the Add the Words protest showed how uncomfortable people are with so much about the LGBTQ community, including their very existence in some cases. Again, in Idaho, the dismissal of legislation from minority lawmakers and Liberty Caucus members, from more centrist Republican chairmen, has shown how uncomfortable people in power are with having some of these uncomfortable policy discussions in public. So basically, instead of hearing why people are upset, they're more focused on the fact that they're upset in the first place. And I think it's important. Sorry, my dog has opinions too, if you can hear him in the background. I think it's important to note how many Idaho Republicans who are calling for civility haven't said anything about the most uncivil presidential discussion we've seen in our life, or presidential administration that we've seen in our lifetimes. So to me, a lot of these calls for civility from these leaders ring hollow. People being angry is different than people engaging in targeted harassment or threats. And those are important to call out and label for what they are. But anger in discourse itself isn't the problem. So all of that was in the before COVID-19. I have thoughts that are specific to COVID-19 that I'm sure we'll get to in the Q&A, but thank you so much for inviting me and for this opportunity.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm glad you're here. All right, Nicole, how about you?
Okay, remembered to unmute before I started talking, so this is going great. Yeah, I have, to kind of reiterate a lot of the things that Melissa discussed, and I guess just kind of open my remarks with saying I have a love-hate, more of a hate relationship with the term civility, mostly because I don't, like Melissa mentioned, it's not always utilized in maybe the way that it's intended. And also too, it's too often, the word civility, calls for civility are too often weaponized by all sides of all issues to characterize an opinion they don't agree with. And also generally from my experience, just working as a reporter and often just writing about some of these calls for civility and issues where people haven't accused people of not being civil, it's often used as a word by people who rarely used by people who rarely interact with people of different political beliefs. And it's also often called for and used by people who a lack of civility doesn't necessarily have any real consequences for their lives. And so, you know, like Melissa said, you know, generally people in power are the ones who are setting the terms for civility. And power means different things for different people. And most often, at least the way we have been seeing it play out, honestly, before coronavirus and after coronavirus, and, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, it's the easiest way to delegitimize someone who you don't agree with, and also someone who you generally have the political power to shut up. And that can have some pretty drastic consequences for people who already don't have a platform, who already, you know, may have some views that are considered to be outside the mainstream. And so it's really something that I think needs to be used cautiously. But I get why people call for civility, because at the very basic, you know, very basic use of the word and the most generous, you know, view of what people mean when they say this is that they're just calling for people and their words to mean something. They want you to mean what they say, and they should. And in the world of politics and journalism, you should mean what you say, and you should be willing to accept the consequences for what you say. And you should also be aware of the meaning that your words have on other people. And then just, you know, again, like Melissa said, I'm sure that we'll get into some of the things that this has changed. But one of the things that I really think is an interesting intersection between civility and journalism is often civility also kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of objectivity that all journalists are kind of asked to report on, sometimes especially these like very heated political issues, and or you know, underrepresented groups that people are reacting really badly to them joining the mainstream conversation. They're asked, you know, you should report on this, yeah, as if it was a civil conversation, as if it, you know, you need to be objective. And that's often something that reporters of color, female reporters, are sometimes have this extra layer of scrutiny that maybe wouldn't be provided to other reporters. And it's interesting for me as a journalist, and as a journalist who likes to study the history of journalism, particularly in Idaho, is that many of the things that journalists sometimes are accused of leaning too far to one side, or being urged to return to a time when news used to be more civil, more objective. If you look at old Idaho newspapers, just looking at Idaho, I think people who say that, they haven't really studied what news used to look like. First of all, it used to be almost entirely opinion. And, you know, everything from, you know, any reporter or editor, usually unnamed, getting to share their sometimes very caustic opinions of a political opponent or another newspaper. But also, if you look at the way, in particular, reporting on Latinos in Idaho, that's usually what I'm searching for, you know, old Idaho news clips for, is any mention of Latinos in Idaho, because they have been here for more than 100 years. It's pretty astonishing to see the way that these supposedly these arbiters of this civil discourse were referring to Native American tribes, to Black people in their community, to Latinos and Mexicans. I wrote a story about this for the Idaho Statesman last year, where it's the nicest thing that a paper in Blackfoot had to say about Mexicans starving in their town was that they should go back home. And so it's really important that when we're talking about civility, and especially when journalists are urged to report on things as if it is a civil conversation, sometimes it simply is not. And it is not subjective or biased to report things out as they are. And also, you shouldn't try to impose civility when there is none. We're meant to report the truth. And sometimes that is the truth, is that there is not a civil conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nicole. We're seeing some really good questions come in, so keep those coming. But Stephanie, I want to make sure that you get a chance to make some opening remarks, and then we'll dive into the Q&A.
Okay. I guess it's left to me to make some kind of defense of civility, huh? You know, I think that everybody agrees that when we're talking about civility, we mean more than politeness. Although I would argue that there is a functionality to politeness, especially in deliberative policymaking bodies like a legislature, where the rules of decorum are there in part to ensure like the continued moving of issues through. But I think it's more than politeness. It doesn't, some of this was touched on by Melissa. It involves a willingness to listen and engage with viewpoints that are other than your own, right? And to respect that others have a difference of opinion. And to me, the most critical change in my lifetime in regard to civility in public life is probably our adoption of the language of war when we're discussing people that have a different opinion than we do. People who disagree with me are not my enemies, they are my opponents, possibly in a political arena if we're trying to pass policy. When someone's your enemy, then any kind of compromise is immediately off the table, because you don't compromise with the enemy, right? It's a black or white, good, bad, white hats, black hats, all that stuff. And so all of the ways in which I might learn from someone who sees an issue differently than I do, and they might learn from me seeing a policy issue differently than they do, stops if they're considered the enemy, and you can't talk to the enemy. That's being a traitor. What do we do to traitors? We kill them. So I think the adoption of that kind of language is so detrimental. And I think words do have power. And certainly the words of people in power can be oppressive. I think that a truly civil forum would allow all of these ideas to emerge. And then we can learn, what do we have in common? And what do we have of difference? And is there a way that we can work towards some compromise that might be a better policy decision than what we have currently? And in regard to COVID, there are some really interesting things here about the role of experts and science and policymakers and the public, and who gets to decide what kind of information we're going to use to make policy decisions, and how we talk about those who disagree with us. And again, I think it gets destructive when we just, we're kind of cutting people out of the conversation by saying, these people are our enemies and we're not going to talk to them. So I think the role of experts in a democracy is fascinating, and I think COVID brings that up a little bit. So relates to civility, because if you don't agree with the experts, what does that mean? So okay, that's all I have, Jen.
Thanks so much, Steph. Okay, we're going to go ahead and switch to some of the questions and answers, but I'm going to just take a moment to remind our radio listeners that you're listening to a City Club of Boise virtual conversation featuring Melissa Davlin, Nicole Foy, and Dr. Stephanie Witt. So thanks again to all of you for those opening remarks, really helpful for understanding your positions on this issue. I think some of the folks listening today are still struggling with what it means to argue that civility can be used to silence those we disagree with. So I think this is probably a question for Melissa and then maybe Nicole. Could you give some examples that you've seen? I'm sort of putting you on the spot, but some examples. You don't have to name particular leaders, but maybe issue areas where groups or people have been silenced through calls for civility?
Absolutely. One example from I believe it was the 2019 legislative session comes to mind. There were a number of proposals on the table that related to voter initiatives. And so things that people put on the ballot to bypass the legislature and make laws themselves. So this legislation was proposed by Senator Groh out of Meridian, and there was, he was invited to a town hall. He didn't go to the town hall, and instead the people who organized the event put up like a cardboard cutout of him so people could talk to. It was the whole idea of like the empty chair at the RNC several years back, right? You know, you can air your grievances here. The conversation the next day turned into how angry Senator Groh's colleagues were that he had been treated like that, as opposed to why people were mad in the first place that they didn't feel like they were being listened to on this pretty stark proposal that was in direct response to Medicaid expansion in 2018. And so because the people in power on that Senate State Affairs Committee were the ones who controlled the conversation, they were able to shift everything from talking about the merits of this proposal to talking about how unfair it was that Senator Groh had been treated like this. Would I have put up a cardboard cutout of a public official to talk to him? No, but there was a reason that people were upset, and that should have been and continue to be the focus of the conversation. And that's, the first of several examples that come to mind, but I'll turn it over to Nicole if she has anything else to add.
Yeah, I guess there's, especially in the context of coronavirus, I don't have like a specific person to tie this to, but this was, I think most people would recognize this as pretty widespread rhetoric. It's really, really interesting to me to anyone who's been following the news in Idaho, and also this is of course not specific to Idaho, is this characterization of the restrictions placed on businesses and people's outings as being compared to the Nazi regime, and police officers who are showing up to bars and telling them that they're currently violating the law if they're open, or being compared to Gestapo. It's really interesting to me to see people some of these groups using these terms, because I remember as a reporter who reports on immigration and also therefore follows a lot of immigration news at the national level, these were some of the same groups of people, same ideological groups, in some cases the same exact people, who objected incredibly strongly to immigration activists and immigrant rights advocates who compared the detention of children and families at the border in objectively difficult conditions as similar to concentration camps, as similar to some of the, especially when the detention was increasingly focused on people, of course, from South America, and also just a lot of non-white immigrants were seeming to be caught up in this in a way that that immigrants from European countries were not. Objected very strongly to this characterization and insisted that it was a denigration of the use of what the Nazis actually were, of what concentration camps were. And as someone who is reporting on this rhetoric and also how it affects real people, it's really interesting to me, and kind of again brings me back to my point, is that while I of course think civility is a worthy pursuit, too often it is weaponized against people you do not agree with, and of course is kind of thrown out the window when you need to make a point. So that's the clearest. It's been really interesting to me to watch that that conversation evolve, mostly because I'm continually impressed by the short-term memories of all of us. But yeah.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Thanks, Melissa, for your response as well. So Dr. Witt, that question wasn't for you, but we have one that is for you. So it seems as if you're trying to maybe defend a larger definition of civility that's not just about politeness, but about listening to others that we disagree with, for example. But someone watching today wonders, okay, so that seems like a good value to have, but how do we enforce that? Who's in charge of keeping things civil, right? When it feels like a lot of the rules that maybe we used to have around how we engage with one another have been broken down. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, I'm not arguing for civility police. I don't think that's going to work out well. In a body like a legislature or the Congress, it would be up to the rules of those chambers and the leadership of those chambers to keep those things in check to their best ability. And when I watch the Idaho legislature, which I do, but not as closely as Melissa and maybe Nicole do, but I see some efforts to maintain civility in that chamber. And, the speaker, for example, has chastised members from time to time for saying something untoward. There was a reference to someone having slept her way into leadership or something, and that the member who said that was, chastised by the speaker. That's an example of the kind of self-regulating that kind of a body can do. Journalists and their editors are control the content of the media. They have a competing need, which is, of course, to get us to all look at it. So I understand the pull, to a more dramatic argument or use of more inflammatory language if you believe that that's going to make somebody read or watch something. But I think that otherwise it's up to us. And, there is no easy way to achieve getting people to listen to people they don't want to. I think if I could offer some constructive feedback, it would be that no one should ever use the example of Nazi Germany in a public policy illustration. It's just, like if you're thinking, gee, I think I'll make its analogy to don't do that. That's probably not a good idea. So, not to be facetious, but mostly in legislative and congressional policymaking things, it is up to the leadership to help guide that. And they have a lot of rules about decorum in legislative chambers to try to create more civil environment. Now, of course, we've had, people fighting on the floors of legislatures and, someone being caned on the floor of the US Senate in our past. So it's not like we've never disagreed. Civility doesn't mean that we suddenly all agree with everybody and we all hold hands and sing kumbaya. It's not like that. We still disagree. We're still angry. And I still think there's a role for those who are dispossessed to speak truth to power, to say the things that aren't being said, and to bring the perspective of those who aren't represented into our public policy discussions. And that, I think, is part of what my colleagues on the panel are trying to describe as the need to speak truth to power. And if you shut out all the voices that aren't like yourself, then you're never going to hear those alternatives.
Yeah, thanks so much. Do either one of you
I
want to
just,
respond? Melissa.
I have to defend the media just a little bit, Dr. Witt. I host a public policy show that airs on Friday nights. No amount of inflammatory rhetoric is going to make that sexy enough for people to tune in, right? Like, I'm speaking not as a journalist about this, but also as, an engaged observer too, that I think that after watching this for several years, I consistently see people who are uncomfortable being called out, the discomfort with the truth to power. They're the ones who are calling for civility the most. And that's part of the reason why it rings a little bit hollow for me in this context, in the context that we've seen at the State House.
So I think we started seeing a lot of the calls that we're seeing now for civility around the time of the 2015-2016 presidential election season. At least that's when it entered my consciousness, sort of as being part of the political and cultural discourse. If civility isn't the right frame, or it has this sort of problematic side that we were talking about, what would be a more productive frame or a more productive concept for us to be thinking about, if not civility? I think people see something that's bothering them. They see a change that happened seemingly overnight. And I'm sure as journalists and professors, you see it too. So do you have thoughts on what might be better? Nicole?
Yeah, I think representation in these conversations are key, because I think one of the other issues that I sometimes will have with this concept of civility is that we overestimate um, we overestimate the breadth and the diversity of voices that we've brought to the table, and the diversity of experiences that are participating in the conversation, and we most certainly overestimate the ability of some particularly underrepresented and marginalized groups to actually access these conversations, or to even, or that these conversations are even relevant to their lives, and not because, you know, not to say that these groups of people are not you know, interested in how to better speak with our neighbor who disagrees with us, but that, like I said at the beginning, is that many people of color, many immigrants, particularly when it comes to undocumented immigrants, these conversations that we're having, like for example, like the immigration debate, they have far more real world consequences for themselves and their family members than you know, than people who are able to get in a room together and just chat and kind of freewheel some ideas that they think might work, and then go home at the end of the day and say, we'll save that for another day. And so I think, you know, consistently making sure that first, the access to the conversation is applicable and much more widespread than it is. But then also too, when you bring in these voices that have not been given the space as they have in the past, I think you honestly have to prepare yourself for a lot of conflict. I think too often we give up too early, and we give up too early. We walk away from relationships and discussions when they become uncivil. And I appreciate many people's right to make that choice for themselves and not participate in that because it's, you know, it's touching on some trauma, or it's not something that they have the bandwidth to participate in. But I think when we're talking about, when you are bringing in people, because again, like when we're having these discussions about civility, it's coming at a time when suddenly there is more access to these issues, that there are more voices at the table that have truly been ignored for more than a century. And so you have to assume there's going to be some conflict. You have to assume that there will be time when everyone is incredibly uncomfortable and angry and probably hurt, but we have to keep coming back.
Okay, so something about pluralism and lots of voices at the table. Melissa, any thoughts on what might replace civility as a more helpful concept?
I think that a lot of this can come down to taking responsibility for oneself, especially those of us who are in any sort of position of power or have platforms like those of us in media do. So instead of worrying about what somebody else is saying and the tone in which they're saying it, I think it's important for me to take it upon myself to understand why they're upset in the first place. I can't control what somebody is saying to me. I can control my reaction to it. And because, you know, as somebody with this platform in media, I do have power there. I do have a platform that other people don't have. So I can control my own reaction to the situation. And I think internalizing some of this and learning from it and listening, those are important things. To bring the discussion to COVID-19, for example, I've seen a lot of I've seen a lot of my peers and colleagues truly not understand why people are upset at the economy closing, you know, going so far as to say that they're grandma killers and they hope that the protesters get COVID-19 and that sort of thing. But it's easy for me and others in my position to say that when I can work from home. I'm not worried about my next paycheck. I am in a very privileged position here, as is my spouse. There are so many people who are not in that same position. you know, whether they are employees or they're small business owners who have worked really, really hard for years and decades in some cases to get where they are. And now all of that's in jeopardy. You know, if I were a small business owner who had been shut down and I see everybody lining up outside of Costco or Home Depot every weekend because they're considered an essential business, I'd be mad too. And so it's my responsibility to figure out where they're coming from. And that's applicable in so many other situations. I think that, you know, because I am in that position of power, it's up to me to strive for decency. It's not up to me to demand civility of other people who are angry with the political climate.
You know, so I hear you sort of articulating empathy as a really important place to be attempting to sort of understand where others are coming from.
Yeah, empathy and understanding and respect. I think that respect is different than civility. You know, civility, like I said, civility to me rings hollow considering who is calling for it in these circumstances. But respect from those of us who are in these privileged positions, respect for people who see the world differently. And I'm not saying to, you know, disregard other points of view, right? I'm not saying disregard the health experts. I think that there is another conversation to touch a little bit on what Dr. Witt was saying about anti-intellectualism and the disregard for experts in our society. But that's been decades in the making, and civility isn't going to fix that. That's a conversation that needs to be had and is a real problem in our society. But as far as having the conversation with people who are currently upset because they are genuinely afraid and worried about how they're going to pay their rent or pay their employees, that comes down to respect and empathy.
We have sort of some larger philosophical questions about democracy. So Dr. Witt, we'll start with you on this one. This question is about the nature of democracy sort of being inherently adversarial. And so if one side decides they're going to be civil and the other side does not, are you putting yourself at a disadvantage in political arguments by, I guess the great example is Michelle Obama saying they go low, we go high. So are the folks on the high road sort of putting themselves at a disadvantage when it comes to political arguments?
Mm. That's a good question. I don't think that if we have civility that means that everybody gets along. I mean, I still think that we are going to disagree deeply about things and that people will still have a lot feeling behind their points of view. But being willing to engage with the other side, to at least allow the expression of the other side's point of view and interests and learning from that, I think is part of what makes good policy. I just don't believe that in any legislative chamber, whether it's the state of Hawaii where the Democrats have an overwhelming majority and they can shut out the Republicans, or in Idaho where the Republicans have an overwhelming majority and they can shut out the Democrats. I don't believe our best policies come from only this one kind of legislator getting to have input into policy. I think that compromise, crossing the aisle, some ideas that have a little bit of this and a little bit of that are more productive. That's just my personal opinion about that. And I think that the way we run our legislatures and our Congress allow shutting out the minority because that's, it's done by majority rule, and the party in the majority gets to pick all the leadership positions on the committees and so on. And so they do control the flow of officially considered ideas. But some of our, greatest policies that we've had at the national level were things that were developed by both Democrats and Republicans who came together to figure out a solution to some problem. So I think that that democracy is inherently conflictual, but that doesn't mean that we're not ever working together on things. If there was ever a national challenge that we need everybody's minds to address and everybody's goodwill to work on, it would be something like COVID-19. Unfortunately, this has happened at a time when polarization in our elected bodies and in the electorate is as great as it's ever been for many, maybe ever, since we've been able to measure it. And so, there's a lot less willingness to work with the other side right now, whatever that. And by the way, there's not only two sides, there are probably many sides to every kind of issue and lots of views that aren't represented by the two major parties. So, when I say it's polarized, then we tend to think just one and the other, but really there are probably a lot of other points of view. I don't think it's a bad thing. That is the plurality of all of our people that live in our democracy, our representative democracy. And so I think that if you think all the good ideas though are only on this one side of the aisle, I think you're missing out on a lot of things. It's the same argument that I make about diversity. It isn't just to say that we're diverse, but we can't afford to not have the talent and the wisdom and the insight of whole categories of people and cut them out of the workplace or of government. We need them at the table. And, in public administration, we talk about something called representative bureaucracy, that the administrative structure will be more legitimate to our constitutional system if the people who work in that bureaucracy reflect the people they serve. So if you don't have anybody who looks like the people they're serving, it's a little harder to gain legitimacy for that. So I think that democracies are conflictual, but that doesn't mean that that you're only listening to one side of an issue.
Okay, thanks, Steph. I need to remind our radio listeners that you are listening to a City Club of Boise virtual conversation featuring Melissa Davlin, Nicole Foy, and Dr. Stephanie Witt. So there's a question that came in that I think is so apt for this conversation today, both in terms of the topic, but also I don't know if you, the participants, have been able to see, but there were some trolls that appeared in the chat. Maybe we're not surprised by that. I would guess the journalists in particular are not surprised by that. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of misinformation, social media, trolls, when we think about this larger discussion about civility. I think there's conversations that are happening in the State House, like Dr. Witt has pointed out, but there also seems to be quite a bit of flow between sort of the culture of trolling and misinformation and some of our policy discussions now. Nicole, do you want to start us off? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Don't know if anyone has really figured out why trolls do the things that they do. At the very least, that and misinformation is a distraction, and sadly, usually a quite successful distraction from often some very well-meaning discussions that people are trying to have. It's something to consider. I personally try not to give those people who are quite clearly just trying to get a rise out of people the time of day, because you give oxygen to to people who are truly not trying to engage in any type of discussion, and that's all they want. It's also sometimes a self-protective measure as well, since I think when it comes to journalists in particular, there is, of course, this attack and this interest to catch journalists who are, at the end of the day, just humans, just trying to do their best work under increasingly difficult circumstances. And so there is this vast interest in trying to catch people in a mistake. And so that's something that I'm very cautious of, and especially as a Latina reporting on Latinos, it's something that I think about every day, and I don't always feel the freedom to respond to or defend myself in ways that maybe other reporters would, because quite frankly, there are many people who already think that I am I should not be doing the work I'm doing because I am biased. That's things that I've specifically been told. So that's something to keep in mind. And then, but also too with misinformation, it can kind of feel like a losing battle, especially right now with coronavirus. There are so many, I mean, I would, as many journalists who I think would back me up on this, we're not just trying to fact check things sometimes for our readers, we're also doing them with people we love and friends and just people who like, because as much as some people may think that all journalists think one way and also all journalists only interact with a certain type of people, I just got to tell you, it's just not the truth. And so often, so many, especially in something evolving like coronavirus, where truly things that we know today have changed from things we know 2 months ago. And that honestly, that sadly makes sometimes us lose credibility. And as we're trying to, through no fault of our own, just, science is changing, especially when you're dealing with something that has not existed before. And so it can feel like a losing battle. And I don't know if I have the answer to that, except that one of the things that I've tried to focus on is just encouraging people to check things, encouraging people to be aware of where something is coming from. What are the motivations for this person to post to that? And honestly, invite that same criticism of our own work, and also just trying to explain what we do. I think really a lot of people forget that we are just people. We are not content farms. And we not only make mistakes, but we usually don't have as much information as we want. We want a lot more information, and we don't have it. So,
thanks, Nicole. Melissa, do you want to talk about trolls and misinformation?
Well, and I think that there are multiple layers here, right? There are trolls who engage in targeted harassment. There are, bots who spread misinformation or propaganda. There's just straight up fake news that is spread. And so those are all kind of different conversations, right? Again, I have control over my own reactions and my own actions. And when it comes to trolls, I used to call them out. Now I mute them. I try to do what I can to set a good example when it comes to decency. There are some well-known social media trolls in the Idaho political social media world that I've muted them all and let them shout into the void at this point. I used to engage with them and now I don't. It's just not worth it. I know that I have power over my reporting, which is very straightforward when it comes to COVID-19. It's based on what we hear from medical experts. It's based on what we hear from business leaders. That this is what is affecting Idahoans, what we're hearing from our viewers throughout the state, because we don't have an audience just in Treasure Valley. Remember, we hit 98% of households in Idaho. And so there are a lot of viewers in places like Witt and Pierce and Bear Lake that have basic questions about what Idaho is doing that we take for granted in Treasure Valley. I have control over that, and I have control over my response, and I can set a good example and be a decent person. And I like to think that even if it's just a tiny little bit of difference, it's something. And to touch on something that Nicole said earlier in the conversation, fake news is not a new phenomenon. If you look at newspapers and information sources, from hundreds of years ago, there are, the horrific story of blood libel was spread in newspapers by reputable news sources that were not, in fact, reputable at all. The difference now is we have more access to information than we ever have before. We have higher literacy rates than we ever have before, and we can spread that information and misinformation in many cases. And so the fake news isn't new. What's new is the means of communication.
Thank you so much. So we only have a few minutes left, but I think a lot of the participants in the discussion today. Would love to hear some nice examples, some good news of decency, to use Melissa's word, if we don't want civility, or you can use civility if that's your preference. Are there examples that you're seeing of people really exhibiting good decency to each other or civil discourse? So Melissa, I see you nodding. So 1 minute for each participant because we're running up against time.
One of the really cool things I've seen in response to COVID-19 is, regardless how people feel about the government's response or even the level of threat, is people have really come together to support local businesses, to join these Facebook mutual aid groups in which, you know, people, families who have immediate needs, immediate material and financial needs, people are joining these groups to help them out. And you know, sometimes conflict pops up in these groups, but for the most part, it's a real solid example of how so many Idahoans and so many of our neighbors want to help and want to do the right thing. And that, to me, I don't want to say silver lining because I don't want to dismiss people's struggles right now, but it's been heartening in a sea of bad news.
It's so hard, like just goodness and decency and looking at the face of your baby, they just all connect. It's so sweet. Nicole, good news, decency, civility.
Let's see, something that I have seen glimpses of, and I truly hope continues, is there is I do not agree with some of the things that people said at the beginning of this pandemic about coronavirus as being the great equalizer, because I think that is absolutely untrue, and we're starting to see stats of how untrue that is for communities of color. However, I do think there is this brief moment where, with so many of our normal trappings and distractions ripped away, we're able to see even more clearly the disparities that have always been there, and that have always existed and that we've gotten very used to. I am concerned that that window of awareness will fade, because it often does. But there has been, I've been really heartened by, particularly when it comes to the Latino community in Idaho and the people who work with the Latino community in Idaho, this very desperate urge to not just identify the people who are being left out and who honestly have been left out of the conversation, but rapidly try to meet those needs. You know, for everything from just, you know, trying to provide internet and healthcare access for people who honestly have never had that, and now it's it's more important, or just the urge, the urgency of the community to try to get stuff in Spanish about coronavirus, when honestly many public officials did not have that same urgency at the beginning, and how the community has really said, we're going to take care of this ourselves. And while I wish that wasn't necessary, it's been nice to see, again, this brief moment where kind of the scales have fallen off, and we see maybe how great some of us have had it, and maybe how we then can try to help our neighbors and our friends and our family who we knew always had these issues and needed help, and now it's more obvious.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And I'm sorry, Stephanie, we are out of time today. It is 1 o'clock, and I want to make sure people can get back to what they need to get back to. Thank you so much to everybody who showed up for our conversation today. Thank you so much, Melissa Davlin, Nicole Foy, Dr. Stephanie Witt, and everybody at City Club for making today's conversation possible. Stay safe out there, and we will see you at our next event.